The morning Hester Penrose was buried the sky over the ridge above Harlan, turned the color of wet slate, and the wind came down from the high timber, carrying the smell of pine resin and the first hard frost of the season. Linnea Ashby stood at the edge of the
We
grave
have
she
to
had dug
move.
herself 3 feet deep into ground
Are you
that was
coming?
half stone and half root, and she watched two men from the lumber company lower the pine box she had built with her own hands. The box was good work. She had jointed the corners with dovetails because her grandmother had taught her that dovetails were the proper joint for anything you meant to last, and she had planned each board smooth on the outside and sanded the inside until the wood was as soft as cloth.
Here you go, buddy.
Because Hester Penrose had spent her whole life with her
Eat
hands
up.
on rough timber,
Good
and
boy.
Linnea wanted her last bed to be gentle. She did not cry. She had not cried when her father Ansel died 2 years before, struck across the back by a falling hemlock limb in the high forest. She had not cried when she found her grandmother in the morning light lying on her side, with one hand tucked beneath her cheek and the other resting on the quilt. She did not cry now. She stood with her arms at her sides and her boots planted in the cold earth, and she watched the box settle into the hole, and she said inside her chest the only thing that came to her, which was, "Thank you," said 3 times the way her grandmother had taught her to say thank you to wood before splitting it to water, before drinking to ground, before turning it with a spade. When the box was down, she took up the shovel and filled the grave herself. The two men from the lumber company stood back. They had known Hester Penrose for 40 years, and they understood that this was not work to be shared. Linnea worked steadily the way her grandmother had taught her to work, with her weight over her hips and her elbows close to her ribs, and her breathing matched to the rhythm of the blade. She was 19 years old. She was 5 feet and 4 inches tall, and she was lean the way a young birch is lean slender, but with a strength that was honest. The strength of someone who had spent her childhood splitting shingles and turning soil and lifting beams into place beside a woman who treated her like a partner rather than a child. Her hands were the hands of someone who worked wood. Short, clean nails, a pale callus along the outside edge of her right palm where the draw knife rode. Faint, dark lines of pine pitch in the creases of her knuckles that would not come out no matter how she scrubbed. She wore a heather gray cotton shirt soft from 100 washings, and over it the heavy brown wool barn coat that had belonged to her grandmother, a coat so old the elbows had been mended twice, and the lining had gone the color of weak tea. Beneath it, dark indigo denim, worn pale at the knees. Brown leather work boots, scuffed at the toes. Her hair was the color of dark walnut, dark brown, going toward black where the light did not reach it, and she had pulled it back into a low, practical tail at the nape of her neck, the way she always wore it when she worked. Her face was the face of a young person who had spent the autumn outdoors, a faint windburn high on her cheekbones, a whisper of sun across the bridge of her nose, a small pale scar above her left eyebrow, where she had fallen against a stone wall at 12 and split the skin and stitched it herself badly with sewing thread because her grandmother had been 3 miles away cutting cedar and there had been nobody else to do it. Her eyes were gray-blue a color, like the river just before sunrise, and they had the quiet, steady attention of someone who had learned to read rooms before entering them, who watched first and spoke after. In the pocket of the barn coat against her ribs, she carried Magnus Penrose's folding knife, bone handle worn warm and yellow as old ivory, brass bolsters, a blade that had been ground so many times across so many years that it was narrow now as a willow leaf. Her grandfather had carried it for 40 years before her grandmother had pressed it into her palm one autumn afternoon, when she was 14 without ceremony, saying only, "He would have liked you." You pay attention the way he did. When the grave was full, Linnea tamped the earth flat with the back of the shovel. She set the headstone Hester had carved for herself 3 years earlier, a slab of river granite with only the name and the dates and one short word beneath which was finished. She stood for a long minute and looked at it. Then she gathered her tools and walked back to the cabin on the ridge, the cabin where her grandmother had lived for 50 years, the cabin where she herself had lived for the last 4 years since her father died, and she opened the door and stepped into the hush of a house whose person was gone. The cabin was a small, good place. One room with a stone fireplace at the north end, and a workbench along the west wall, and a narrow bed in the corner where her grandmother had slept and died. Above the workbench hung the tools, each one on its peg, each peg labeled in her grandmother's slanted handwriting, the labels yellow with age: draw knife, fro, hand plane smooth, hand plane jack, auger 3/4, auger half, a wooden mallet with its head worn smooth and dished from 40 years of use, a frame saw with a tensioning rod her grandfather had turned on the foot lathe in the corner. Above the tools on a high, narrow shelf, three things her grandmother had kept for reasons she had never explained. A piece of carved birch the size of a thumb, which Linnea had never been allowed to touch. A small, flat tin that held 3 brass needles and a card of wax thread. In a single sealed envelope addressed to no one, that her grandmother had laid on the shelf the spring before she died and never spoken of again. Linnea sat down at the workbench in her grandmother's chair, and the wood of the chair settled under her weight in a way that was familiar enough to hurt. She did not move for a long time. The light through the west window had gone amber, then rose, then the soft slate blue that comes before dark in mountain country, and still she sat. She thought about the way her grandmother's hands had looked when she had washed them that morning before dressing her for the burial. The knuckles swollen, the fingers slightly curled even at rest, the palms thick and smooth as saddle leather. She had washed each finger separately. She had said the thank you for each one. She had not cried. She slept that night in her grandmother's bed because she could not bear to sleep in her own, and she dreamed of a place she had never been. A stone building taller than any building she had seen, with a tower at one corner and a great wooden door. And her grandmother stood in the doorway with one hand raised, not waving, only resting in the air as though she were testing the wind. When Linnea woke, the dream stayed with her the way some dreams do. Behind the eyes waited, refusing to be looked at directly. She lived alone in the cabin for 9 days. She kept the garden. She fed the 2 hens. She split a cord of firewood from the cedar pile and stacked it under the eaves. She mended the latch on the goat shed. She did all the things she would have done if her grandmother were still alive. And she did them well. And she did them quietly. And she did not allow herself to think about what would come next, because what came next was a question she did not yet have the strength to ask. On the 10th day, the question answered itself. She had walked down the ridge road into Harlan to buy a half-pound of salt at the company store, and she had stopped at the boarding house where her mother Josephine and her brother David had been living for the last 4 years, and she had found the door locked. There was a note pinned to the frame with a single tack. The note was written in the careful clerk's hand of a man named Mortimer Pratt, who had moved into her mother's life some 18 months earlier, with the patient persistence of damp working its way into a foundation, and the note said this: Linnea, your mother and I have discussed the matter, and we have determined that it is no longer practical for you to consider this address a place of return. Your effects are in the box by the step. We wish you well. Monsieur Pratt. She read the note once. She read it a second time because the first time the words had not arranged themselves into meaning, and she stood on the boarding house porch with the note in her hand and the wind coming up off the river. And she felt the cold travel up through her boots and into her shins and into her chest. And she understood that something had happened and that the something was permanent. She bent to the box by the step. Inside the box was a folded change of clothes, a pair of wool stockings rolled into a ball, her grandmother's quilt, the one Hester had made the winter of 1847, the year Magnus died, the one with the nine-patch stars in butternut and indigo, and a small tin coffee can with a fitted lid. She lifted the lid. Inside the can were 3 copper pennies worn smooth, each one slightly darker than the next. 3 cents. Her savings. Everything she had earned that summer for the mending and the egg money she had given her mother to hold for her 3 months at a time, the way a daughter trusts a mother to hold things. She knelt beside the box for a long minute. Then she did something her grandmother had taught her to do when a piece of work went wrong in a way that could not be repaired. She stopped. She closed her hands. She took 3 slow breaths through her nose. She allowed the size of the loss to be the size it was without making it larger and without making it smaller, and she waited until her hands were steady enough to use again. Then she stood. She did not knock on the door. She did not call out for her mother. She did not call out for David, who was 23 now, and married and somewhere behind that locked door, almost certainly sitting with his back to it and his face in his hands, because David was a person who loved her and could not afford to show it. She took the quilt and the clothes and the stockings and the coffee can. She tied the bundle with the length of cord she had in her coat pocket. She slung it over her shoulder. She turned and walked down the steps and into the road, and she walked west, because west was the direction her boots happened to be pointed when she reached the end of the road and had to choose. She did not look back. If anyone watched her go, they watched from behind the curtain of the upstairs window, which is the way that cowardice always watches courage from a safe distance through a veil. She walked for the rest of that day. She walked along the main road for 3 miles until it forked, and she took the left fork because it was narrower and quieter and led away from town. She walked through a stand of ponderosa pine, where the trunks rose orange and straight in the late light, and the wind moved high in the crowns and did not come down to where she walked. She crossed a creek on a bridge of 3 hewn logs laid side by side, and she knelt on the bridge and drank from her cupped hands, and the water was so cold it made her teeth ache, and the ache cleared her head. She climbed a long switchback up the side of a slope covered in bunch grass and silver sage, and at the top of the slope, just as the sun was settling behind a far range of mountains she could not name, she came over the rise and saw the valley. It opened below her wide and long and bounded on 3 sides by mountains whose upper slopes were dark with timber, whose peaks still held the last of the previous winter's snow. A river ran down the center of it, narrow and steady, catching the last of the light in a way that made it look like a ribbon of hammered tin laid across the brown and gold of the autumn grass. There were ranches scattered along the floor of the valley, the dark shapes of barns and the thin lines of fence, the occasional smudge of chimney smoke. But they were widely spaced. The overall impression was of enormous quiet. She stood at the top of the slope and looked out at it for a long time, and she felt something shift inside her chest. Not hope exactly, only the place where hope could be if she chose to let it. She descended into the valley as the shadows of the mountains lengthened across the grass. The air had turned cold enough that she could see her breath. She walked along the river road for another mile, and as the light failed, she found a sheltered place beneath the spreading branches of an old hemlock at the road's edge. She gathered enough dry needles to make a bed. She spread her grandmother's quilt. She did not light a fire. She had no matches, and she had no skill at making fire from nothing, and she was too tired to learn tonight. She ate the last heel of bread she had carried from the cabin, and she lay down on the quilt and pulled the barn coat over her like a blanket, and she put her hand into the pocket of the coat and closed her fingers around the bone handle of her grandfather's knife, and she slept. She woke in the gray light before dawn to the sound of something breathing. Not loud, not threatening, only the steady, soft breathing of an animal that had settled itself nearby and was waiting to see what she would do. She did not move. She opened her eyes slowly and turned her head only as much as she needed to, and 10 feet from the hemlock in the strip of pale grass at the edge of the road she saw him. He was sitting on his haunches with his front paws set neatly together. He was watching her. He was a medium-sized, mixed-breed dog, perhaps 40 pounds lean and muscular, in the way of an animal that had been living rough for a long time, and had not gone hungry, but had not gone soft either. His coat was short and dense, and the color of warm honey, a tawny brown that caught the gray dawn light and held it, and across his back and over his shoulders ran a darker saddle of brown that shaded toward black at the spine. Down the center of his forehead, beginning between his ears and running straight to the tip of his muzzle, was a single clean line of white, a blaze the width of 2 fingers, perfectly placed like a mark made on purpose by a careful hand. His right ear stood straight up, alert. His left ear folded forward at the tip and gave him a thoughtful, uneven look. There was a small V-shaped notch in the top edge of the right ear, an old healed injury that had become part of him. His eyes were warm and dark, the color of amber held to candlelight, and they were intelligent eyes, and they were watching her without fear and without aggression, only with the steady, patient attention of a creature trying to decide whether she was the kind of person who could be approached. He wore a thin nylon collar around his neck, faded to the color of dried blood with no tags. Linnea did not move for a long time. She had learned from her grandmother how to be still in the presence of a wild thing. You did not stare. You did not reach. You let the animal see you. You let it understand that you had time. She lay on her side under the barn coat with her hand still in the pocket on the knife, and she let her face soften the way her grandmother had taught her to soften her face when she wanted a difficult horse or a frightened child to come closer, and she said nothing. The dog tilted his head. The folded left ear flicked once. He did not move from his sit. After a long minute, Linnea sat up slowly. She kept her movements small. She reached into her bundle and found the last of the bread, which was only a corner now, only enough for 2 bites, and she broke it in half and laid one half on the grass at arm's length from her, and she set the other half on the quilt beside her own knee, and she waited. The dog watched the bread. He watched her. He watched the bread again. He stood, and she saw the easy economy of his motion, the way his muscles slid under the coat. He stepped forward once, twice. He stopped 6 feet from her. He lowered his head and lifted the piece of bread from the grass with a delicacy that was almost ceremonial, and he chewed it twice and swallowed it. And he looked at her again, and she saw in his amber eyes something she recognized because she had seen it that morning in her own face, in the small mirror above her grandmother's washstand. She had seen the look of a creature who had been turned out of a home and had not yet decided what came next. She held out the second piece of bread in her open palm. He came forward. He took it from her hand more carefully than any dog she had ever fed, his lips brushing her skin without his teeth touching her at all. He chewed. He swallowed. He sat down again, this time 3 feet from her, and he laid his ears back the smallest amount, the right one going partly flat against his head, the left one folding deeper, and he waited. She reached out very slowly and laid the back of her hand near his shoulder, and he leaned into it. And that was all. That was the whole conversation. Two creatures who had been put out into the cold by the people who were supposed to keep them, recognizing each other across the dawn and deciding without words to go forward together. She slept another hour with her hand resting on his back, and when she rose, he rose with her. She rolled the quilt and tied her bundle. He waited. She set out walking west along the river road, and he fell in at her left side, a half step behind the way a working dog walks with a person it has chosen. And he did not run ahead, and he did not lag. And after a quarter mile, she looked down at him and said the first word she had spoken aloud since she had stood at her grandmother's grave 9 days earlier. She said Ridge. She said it because of the saddle of darker brown along his back, which had reminded her when the morning light first caught it of the long timbered ridge above her grandmother's cabin where she had grown up. The dog looked up at her. His amber eyes met hers. His tail moved once against the grass. She said it again. Ridge. And he knew his name from that morning on, the way some animals know their names the first time, because the name fits and the person saying it means it, and there is nothing left between the creature and its name to argue with. They walked through the morning together. The valley was wider than it had looked from the rise, and the road bent slowly south along the river, and the cottonwoods along the bank had gone the color of beaten gold, and the wind moved their leaves with a sound that was almost like applause. Linnea walked with her hands in the pockets of the barn coat. Ridge walked at her left side. When she stopped to drink from the river, he drank beside her. When she stopped to lift a stone from the road that had caught her eye, a piece of pale limestone with a fossil shell embedded in it, the size of a coin, he sat and waited until she had turned the stone over twice and put it back where she had found it. He did not chase rabbits. He did not chase the magpies that flickered along the fence lines. He walked with her with the patient, focused attention of an animal whose entire life had narrowed that morning to one task, which was the task of going wherever she went. By midday, they came to a small crossroads. 4 buildings stood at the meeting of the roads. A general store with a porch and a hitching rail, and a coffee can full of cigar stubs beside the door. A blacksmith shop with its forge dark and its great anvil silent. A schoolhouse with a single chimney painted white, once gray now. And a low stone building with a slate roof and a single narrow window, and a hand-lettered sign nailed to the door that read in faded paint, Corbin Valley Land Office. E. Whitaker, Assessor. The store was closed. The blacksmith shop was closed. The schoolhouse was empty, but there was lamplight in the window of the land office, and a thin line of smoke rising from the stovepipe, and Linnea walked toward it because the light meant warmth and possibly information, and because the coffee can in her pocket held 3 copper pennies, and she had begun to understand that those 3 pennies were going to have to mean something, or they were going to mean nothing, and the difference would depend on what she did next. She pushed open the door. The hinges spoke softly. Ridge stopped at the threshold and looked up at her, and she nodded once, and he came in at her heel. The room was small and low and warm. A cast iron stove burned in the corner. Behind a desk made of rough-sawn pine sat a man of perhaps 65, white-haired, clean-shaven, his spectacles pushed up onto his forehead. He had been writing in a large ledger book that lay open before him, and he set down his pen as she entered, and he looked at her with a directness that was not unkind. He took in the barn coat, the bundle on her shoulder, the boots, the dog at her left side. He took in her gray-blue eyes and the small pale scar above her left eyebrow that caught the lamplight as she turned her face toward him. He took in the steadiness of her gaze, which did not waver, which did not ask him for anything, yet which only waited. He said, "You have come a long way." She said, "I have." He said, "Sit down, there is coffee." She sat in the wooden chair he indicated beside the stove. Ridge lay down at her feet and put his chin on the toe of her boot, and the small notch at the top of his right ear flicked once and then was still. The man rose and poured coffee from a tin pot into a tin cup and brought it to her, and she wrapped her cold hands around it and let the heat travel into her palms before she drank. His name, he said, was Elias Whitaker. He had been the county assessor for the Corbin Valley for 26 years. He knew every parcel of land in the valley the way a shepherd knows every animal in his care by name and history and temperament, and he asked her after a polite minute in which he allowed her to drink and to gather herself what had brought her here. She did not tell him everything. She told him only what was necessary. She told him she was looking for land. She told him she had $3 to spend. He did not laugh. He did not look surprised. He removed his spectacles and cleaned them on the cuff of his shirt and replaced them. And he studied her for a long, quiet moment with the expression of a man who was running through a list he kept in his head, comparing what he saw in front of him with what he remembered of every property he had on his books. He turned the pages of his ledger slowly. His finger went down a column, stopped, moved on, stopped again, moved on. He looked up at her over the rims of his spectacles and he said, "There is one property, 40 acres at the head of the East Fork. It has been on the county books with unpaid taxes for 11 years. Nobody has ever come to claim it. The total owed is $2.80. She set the coffee cup down. She took the coffee can from her bundle and laid it on his desk and opened the lid and counted out the 3 pennies one at a time and pushed them across the pine surface toward him. He looked at the pennies. He looked at her. He looked at the dog at her feet. He said, "Miss Ashby." She had not told him her name. She froze. Her fingers, which had been resting on the rim of the coffee can, went still. Ridge lifted his head from her boot. Elias Whitaker saw her freeze, and he raised one weathered hand a few inches off the desk in the small, calming gesture of an older man who has known many startled animals in his life. He said, "Hester Penrose was a friend of mine. I knew her when we were both young, back when this valley was still being settled. I knew Magnus too. Hester wrote to me this past spring. She told me she was tired and that her granddaughter, who was the best young craftsman in 3 counties, might one day need a place to stand. I read the letter twice. I kept it. I have it still." He reached into the drawer of his desk and took out an envelope. The envelope was unsealed and the address was in her grandmother's slanted handwriting, and the address was his name. Linnea looked at the envelope. She did not pick it up. He said, "I am not going to sell you that 40 acres because Hester asked me to. I am going to sell it to you because nobody else in 11 years has been willing to take it, and because you walked 20 miles to get here, and because the dog on the floor has chosen you, and dogs are reliable judges. The price is $2.80. He wrote out a receipt in the ledger. He tore the page. He pushed it across the desk. He said, "You should know before you walk up to it what you are walking up to. The 40 acres holds a building on it. The building is not a cabin. The man who built it was a master stonemason from Bergen in Norway who came to this valley in 1840 with his wife and built what he could not stop himself from building. The people in the valley call it Holmes Folly. It has a tower. It has 7 chimneys. It has a hall with a vaulted roof. It is the largest private structure within 100 miles in any direction. It has stood empty for 11 years because no person of ordinary intention has been able to imagine what to do with it." He paused. He said, "Hester told me in her letter that you might be a person of unordinary intention." He folded his hands on the desk. He said, "The road out is the one you came in on. Take the river road east for 4 miles. Turn at the line of cottonwoods. Follow the creek upstream for 2 miles. You will see it before you reach it. Nobody mistakes it for anything else. Linnea picked up the receipt. She folded it once. She put it in the inside pocket of the barn coat against her chest, next to where her grandmother's letter, still unread, sat heavy as a stone she had not yet decided how to carry. She said, "Thank you." He said, "Sleep here tonight. The road is long and the building is colder than you can imagine until you have stood inside it. Go in the morning." He spread a blanket for her beside the stove. She lay down on it without taking off her coat. Ridge curled against her side, his warm flank along her ribs, his head resting in the crook of her arm. She put her hand in her pocket and closed her fingers around the bone handle of her grandfather's knife, and she thought about the building she had not yet seen. A tower, 7 chimneys, a vaulted hall. She thought about her grandmother's dream, the dream of the stone doorway and the hand raised in the wind. She did not yet understand. She did not yet know that the building she was walking toward had been built by a man who had taken her grandfather as his apprentice in the spring of 1838, when Magnus Penrose was a young craftsman and Eric Holm was 34, and that the line of trade that ran from Bergen to the Corbin Valley to the ridge above Harlan was a line her own hands had been walking down since she was old enough to hold a knife. She did not yet know any of this. She knew only that she had 3 cents fewer than she had owned that morning, and a receipt in her pocket, and a dog asleep against her side, and a place to go in the morning. She slept. Outside, the first hard frost of the season settled on the grass at the crossroads, and the moon rose over the valley, and somewhere 4 miles east at the head of the East Fork, in a clearing above a creek that no one had walked beside. In a long time, the great stone building waited under its mantle of cold, with its tower and its 7 cold chimneys, and its broken windows and its oak door bound with iron holding. Inside it, the dark and the silence, and the patient unbroken promise of work that had been done well by hands long gone, work that was still good work, that was waiting for someone who could see it. In the morning, Linnea Ashby and the dog called Ridge walked east into the rising sun, and the road climbed gently, and the cottonwoods Whitaker had described stood in a line along a side track, golden and ragged in the cold light, and she turned and followed them. And the creek met her at the second bend, and she walked beside it upstream as he had told her to. And after 2 miles, the creek bent again, and the trees opened, and she stopped where she stood. Ridge stopped beside her. His ears came forward. The white blaze down the center of his forehead caught the morning sun. Linnea looked up at the building, and the building looked back at her, and her breath went out of her in a long, slow exhale that she did not hear herself make, because there are some sights for which the body has no answer, ready only the silence of recognition. It rose out of the meadow above the creek in 3 full stories of cut limestone. The stones fitted so closely that from where she stood she could not see the mortar between them. The walls were thick. She could tell from the way the windows were set deep into them, like eyes in a cliff face, that the stone was at least 18 inches through. At the northeast corner, a square tower rose another full story above the roofline, capped with a peaked slate cap that had collapsed in one corner, but otherwise stood. She counted the chimneys. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. They rose from the roof at intervals along the length of the building, each one built of the same pale limestone. Each one capped, most of them still intact. A wide stone porch ran along the south face, with a heavy timber lintel above a great oak door bound in iron straps, and the door itself had gone gray with the years, but it stood square in its frame. And even from 100 yards, Linnea could see that the door had been hung by a person who understood what doors were for. The slate roof had failed in 3 places. The glass was gone from most of the windows. The garden that had once surrounded the porch was a tangle of dead bindweed and yellow thistle. A great oak had fallen across the eastern end of the building in some storm long past, and its trunk lay half-rotted against the wall where the stone had held without complaint. Linnea stood in the meadow with her hand resting on Ridge's shoulder, and she felt the wind come down out of the upper valley and move across the front of the building, and she heard it find the broken windows and pass through, and the sound it made was the sound of a great instrument that had not been played in a long time, but had not forgotten its tuning. She did not move for a long minute. Then she walked forward because there was nothing else to do, and Ridge walked at her left side, his tawny coat warm against her knee, the small notch in his right ear flicking once as a magpie called from the fallen oak. And the great oak door grew larger as she approached it, and she came up the 3 broad limestone steps, and she put her hand flat against the door, and she felt through her palm the cold weight of 50,000 pounds of stone above her head, and she pushed. The door did not move at first. It had settled into the stone of the threshold. She set her shoulder against it and pushed harder the way her grandmother had taught her to push against a heavy thing, with her legs and her core and not with her arms. And the door gave way with a long, low groan that traveled up through the stone of the walls and into the silence inside. She stepped through. Ridge came with her. The hall opened above her in a single vast space that ran the full length of the building. The roof was 30 feet above her head. The vaulted ceiling of dark timbers ran from one end of the hall to the other in a series of arched trusses, each one cut and joined with a care that made her chest tighten. A great fireplace rose along the north wall, its hearthstone a single slab of limestone the size of a small wagon, its mantel a beam of black oak 12 inches square that ran the full width of the firebox. At the far end of the hall, a wide staircase of stone and oak rose toward the upper floors. Light came down through the broken places in the roof in great pale columns, and the dust hung in those columns the way fish hang in clear water, and the air smelled of old wood and cold stone and something faintly sweet that she could not yet name. She stood in the doorway, and Ridge stood beside her with his head lifted and his nose working slowly at the cold air, and she looked up at the first of the great arched trusses above her, and she saw carved into the oak at the point where the truss met the wall plate 2 letters in a year. EH 1841. She closed her hand on the bone handle of the knife in her pocket. The brass bolster pressed warm against her palm where a small mark she had never quite been able to read sat on the metal. A mark she had run her thumb across 1,000 times since her grandmother had given her the knife at 14. A mark she had thought all her life was only a maker's stamp worn down by time. She looked up at the carved letters in the truss above her. She looked down at the knife. She did not yet understand what she was seeing, but the silence in the great hall pressed in on her gently from every direction, and the dust moved in the columns of pale light, and the dog at her left side sat down on the cold stone floor and laid his chin on the toe of her boot and waited. And somewhere in the building above her, in the dark of the upper stories, the wind found a broken pane and made a single soft note, like the first note of a hymn before the rest of the choir has come in. And Linnea Ashby, 19 years old, with 3 fewer pennies than she had owned that morning, and a receipt in her pocket, and a dog at her feet, and a knife in her hand whose meaning she had not yet learned, stood inside the cold, ringing emptiness of Holmes' Folly, and she understood for the first time in many days that she had not stopped walking yet, that the walking had only changed shape, and that the next part of her life was about to begin. She slept that first night on the cold limestone floor of the great hall, with her grandmother's quilt rolled twice beneath her, and the barn coat spread over her like a second blanket, and Ridge curled into the bend of her body with his back against her ribs. The wind came down out of the upper valley after midnight and found every broken pane and every empty window, and the building sang above her in a low chorus of small breathy notes, and she lay awake for hours listening to it, the way a person listens to a stranger speaking a language she has begun against all expectation to recognize. In the gray light before dawn, she rose. Ridge rose with her. The notch at the top of his right ear flicked once as he stretched, and the white blaze down his forehead caught the first weak light through the eastern windows, and she rested her palm a moment on the warm flat of his shoulder before she stood up to begin the work. She walked the building from end to end with her hands clasped behind her back, the way her grandmother had taught her to walk through a job before laying a tool to it. You did not touch anything yet. You only looked. You let the building tell you in the order it wanted to tell you what was wrong with it and what was still good. Hester Penrose had said a building was like a sick person. You did not start the cure until you had heard the whole complaint. The hall was 60 feet long and 28 feet wide, and the truss ceiling rose 30 feet above the slate floor. 3 of the 7 great oak trusses were sound. 2 had developed a sag at the center where the slate above them had failed and let in 20 winters of snow and water. 1, the easternmost, had been struck by the great oak, whose trunk still lay against the eastern wall outside, and the truss had cracked through one of its lower cords, the dry split running clean from one knot to the next. The 7th truss at the far end above the staircase was as straight and true as the day Eric Holm had cut it. She climbed the wide stone and oak staircase to the 2nd floor and found 4 bedchambers along a central corridor, each one with its own narrow fireplace built into the thickness of the outer wall. The fireplaces were intact. The corridor floor was good oak. 3 of the 4 chamber doors still hung on their hinges. The 4th had fallen and lay flat on the floor where it had fallen undisturbed for what looked like the better part of a decade. She climbed the 2nd staircase to the 3rd floor and found a long open room under the slope of the roof, a room that had once been used for storage and for sleeping in the warmer months, where summer light would have poured in through 6 dormer windows along the southern slope. 3 of the dormers had failed. The other 3 held. She climbed the spiral stair into the northeast tower. The tower stair was narrow and steep, hand-cut limestone treads, winding upward around a central pillar, and the tower itself opened above her into a single small square room, 35 feet above the meadow, with a window on each of its 4 walls, and the wind through the broken panes was so cold up there that her eyes watered as she looked out. She stood at the south window and looked down across the valley, and from that height she could see the river bending silver through the meadows and the cottonwoods along its banks, like a line of gold thread laid across brown wool, and the dark shapes of barns 4 and 5 miles down the floor of the valley. From this room a person could see weather coming an hour before it arrived. From this room a person could see a rider on the river road before he saw the building. She stood with her hands on the cold stone of the window casing, and she understood, with a kind of slow inward recognition, that Eric Holm had built this tower not as a folly, but as a thing. A working person needed a place from which the land could be read. She came down out of the tower and into the yard. Behind the main building, set 50 feet back through the dead grass, stood a smaller, separate structure she had not seen the day before. A workshop, built of the same pale limestone as the main hall, with a slate roof partly fallen, and a great pair of barn-style doors hung on long iron hinges. And inside the workshop, when she pushed the doors open with her shoulder, she found a forge. A stone-built forge with its bellows mechanism still in place, though the leather had rotted to strips. a heavy stone anvil base, the anvil itself long since taken. A long work table along the south wall and along the north wall, a stone bench built into the wall itself 3 inches thick, polished smooth by use the bench, where a stoneworker had sat for years to cut and shape the limestone blocks that had built every wall around her. She stood in the doorway of the workshop and Ridge sat down beside her in the cold sun, and she said aloud to nobody only because the words had to come out of her chest before she could carry them. She said, "He built it all himself." Ridge looked up at her. His amber eyes were patient. She said, "He built every stone of it himself." She went back into the hall and she got to work. She started with the roof because a building without a roof is a suggestion rather than a shelter, and the autumn rains were coming. She felled cedar in the stand behind the workshop, choosing trees of the right diameter, the way her grandmother had taught her reading the grain, by the cant of the bark, leaving the trees that wanted another 5 years and taking the ones that had stopped growing. She bucked the trunks into bolts 20 inches long. She found the froe still hanging on its peg inside the workshop, and the froe was a good one. Eric Holmes' froe by the mark on its handle, and she set it against an oilstone she had carried in her bundle and brought the edge up to true. She split shakes from the cedar bolts in the slow rhythmic work that had been her favorite work since she was 12. The work she could do all day without growing tired, the froe biting into the bolt and the cedar parting along its grain with a clean, fibrous tear. One shake after another, stacking them in courses to dry. Ridge lay in the sun at the edge of the workshop while she worked. He watched her. When she paused to drink water from the creek, he rose and went with her. When she returned to the workshop, he settled back in the same patch of sun. On the second day, while she was in the high timber selecting another tree, she heard a horse on the creek road below coming up at an unhurried walk. She came down out of the trees with her axe in her hand, and Ridge came to her side and they stood together at the edge of the meadow and watched the rider approach. He was an old man on a steel gray horse. He was perhaps 65. He wore a heavy oilskin coat and a flat-brimmed wool hat, and his face was weathered the deep brown of a person who had spent 50 winters outdoors, and his eyes, when he reached the meadow and reined the horse in, were pale and watchful and not unfriendly. He looked at her. He looked at the building. He looked at the stack of fresh split shakes. He looked at the dog. He said, "You're the one Whitaker spoke of." She said, "I am." He said, "My name is Asa Halverson. I run cattle on the section below this one. I have ridden past this place twice a year for 11 years, and I have never once seen smoke from any of its chimneys. I saw smoke yesterday. I came up to see who was burning it." She said, "I am." He dismounted slowly the way an old horseman dismounts, and he tied the gray to a section of standing fence rail that had once been part of a paddock, and he walked across the meadow toward her with a deliberateness that was not pride, but only the pace of a man who had stopped hurrying many years before. He stopped 6 feet from her. He looked at the axe in her hand. He looked at the calluses along the outside edge of her right palm. He looked at her face. He said, "You know what this building is?" She said, "I know it is stone." He said, "It is more than stone." He turned and looked up at the great hall. The morning sun lit the south face of the building, and the 7 chimneys cast their long, thin shadows down the slate of the roof, and the white blaze on Ridge's forehead caught the same light as the dog leaned against her knee. Asa Halverson said Eric Holm was from Bergen. I was from Stavanger. We did not know each other in the old country. He came to this valley in the spring of 1840 with his wife Annika and a wagon and 4 oxen and tools enough to outfit a small village. He told me once, the only time he ever spoke of it, that every master mason in our tradition is required when he has earned his mark to build one stenhus, one honor house, one building made entirely by his own hand, from the laying of the foundation to the cutting of the last stone to prove what his hand is worth. In the old country, a mason builds his stenhus in his home village and lives in it the rest of his life and passes it to his children. Eric had no village to go back to. He came here. He built it here. She said, "How long did it take him?" Asa Halverson said, 8 years. He started it in 1841. He finished it in 1849. 3 months after he finished it, he took a fever and he was dead in 3 days. He was 46 years old. He never lived in the building he had spent 8 years building. He lived in a sod hut at the edge of the meadow with Annika the whole time he was building. The hut is gone now. The grass took it back. He paused. He said, "I helped him raise the seventh truss, the far one, over the staircase. It is the only piece of this building that another man's hands touched. Eric let me help him because the truss was too heavy for him to lift alone, and he could not bring himself to ask for more help than that. He paid me in coffee. We drank it at the foot of the truss when it was up. That was 21 years ago. I have not been inside this building since the day Annika locked the door and rode west to her sister in Salem." He looked at Linnea. He said, "You are 19 years old." She said, "I am." He said, "Hester Penrose's granddaughter." She said, "I am." He nodded once slowly as if a question had been answered. He said, "I have a sack of lime in my barn that I bought 12 years ago for a job I never did. I will bring it tomorrow." He turned and walked back to his horse and mounted and rode away, and he did not look back, and Ridge sat at Linnea's knee and watched him go the small notch at the top of the right ear, flicking once as the gray horse cleared the bend. The word that Asa Halverson had spoken in the meadow that morning Stenhus traveled through the valley by the slow methods such words travel in places where people live far apart. Within a week, 5 different people had ridden up the East Fork to look at her. Ida Bergstrom came on foot from the wide bottomland 4 miles down. She was 44 broad-shouldered, her face open and weathered, and she carried a basket covered with a check cloth. In the basket were a loaf of dark bread and a jar of blackberry preserves and a wedge of hard cheese wrapped in cloth, and 6 eggs, each one wrapped separately in scraps of wool. She set the basket on the porch step and said, "I am Ida. Asa told us. I brought you some things." And she looked up at the great oak door and the 7 chimneys, and she said in a softer voice, "Annika would have been glad to see smoke from those chimneys." Dawson Greaves was the blacksmith from the crossroads. He rode up 2 days later on a heavy bay mule, and in his saddlebags he carried a box of hand-forged nails and a new set of strap hinges for the chamber doors upstairs, and a length of iron rod he had drawn in his forge, specifically because he had heard the great oak door was sagging on its hinges, and he had remembered the size of the hinge pins Eric Holm had used in 1841, and he had matched them. He was 38. He helped her rehang the great door that afternoon and showed her a trick for setting a hinge pin so that it would not work loose. And as they worked, he told her that his own father had shod Eric Holm's mules in the year 1842, when Dawson himself had been a boy of 9, and that Eric had paid his father not in money, but in a single small carved wooden bird, which Dawson still had on the mantel in his shop, and would she like to see it sometime. Imogen Marsh came on a Tuesday. She was 29 and taught school at the one-room schoolhouse at the crossroads, and she kept bees on a quarter-acre behind the school, and she had thin, sharp features and quick gray eyes, and the practical, no-wasted motion manner of a person who had been responsible for 40 children at once since the age of 18. She brought 2 panes of window glass wrapped in burlap, and a small clay crock of honey, and a copy of a seed catalog that was 2 years out of date. She said, Asa said you would need glass. I have more if you need it. A boy named Halver Lund came up the creek road with a handcart on the following Thursday. He was 14. His mother had sent him, he said, with a cast iron cookpot and a heavy skillet and a set of tin plates and a small enameled coffee pot, and the message that the well water was sweet if Linnea let it sit overnight before drinking. The boy stood for a long time in the great hall, looking up at the trusses with his mouth open, and before he left he said in a half-whisper, "My grandfather worked one summer hauling stone for the man who built this." And then he ran for the door as if he had said something he should not have said. Linnea accepted everything with the same quiet gravity. She did not make speeches of thanks. She said the words, and she meant the words, and the people who brought things saw that she meant them because she handled what they gave her with the careful attention of a person who had not had much given to her in a long time. And she worked. From the hour the light was strong enough to see by until the hour it was not, she worked, and the building changed around her the way a living thing changes when it is cared for slowly and then all at once. She had been at it 16 days when the cold cleared overnight, and the morning came up bright and so still she could hear the creek 100 yards from the porch, and Ridge would not eat. He stood in the great hall in the column of pale light that came down through the broken roof, and he stood in one specific place in front of the great north fireplace, exactly 4 feet from the slab of limestone that served as the hearthstone, and he would not move from the spot. She came and crouched beside him and offered him a strip of the dried venison Asa had brought her on his second visit, and Ridge took it from her hand politely and laid it on the floor without eating it, and looked at her, and then looked at the hearthstone, and then looked at her. She said, "What is it?" He scratched once lightly with the claws of his right front paw at the seam where the hearthstone met the slate floor of the hall. The white blaze on his forehead caught the morning light. His amber eyes were steady on her face. She said again more quietly, "What is it?" He scratched a second time. He whined low in his throat. He did not move from the spot. She rose. She went to the workshop and brought back a pry bar in a length of heavy oak. She knelt beside the hearthstone and she ran her fingers along the seam between stone and slate. She found, after a long minute of searching, a place along the back edge of the hearthstone where the limestone had been cut at a slight angle, an angle so subtle she would not have seen it if her hand had not found it first. The hearthstone was not seated on the slate floor. It was seated on a recess. It had been designed to lift. She slid the pry bar into the angled seam. She set the oak as a fulcrum. She put her weight on the bar. The hearthstone lifted with a slow grinding sigh, like a great door opening in a wall that had not been a door yesterday, and a square hole opened in the floor beneath it, lined with cut limestone, a stone-walled chamber 3 feet deep and 2 feet square, the corners as clean as the day they had been cut, the inside as dry as a closed cupboard. Inside the chamber, sitting in the center on the dust of 21 years, was an oak chest bound with iron straps. Ridge sat down beside the open chamber and put his chin on her knee. She lifted the chest out. It was heavier than she expected. She set it on the slate floor in the column of pale light, and she ran her fingers across the iron straps, and the iron was cold, and the oak was sound, and the small forged padlock that hung from the hasp had been left unlocked. She lifted the lid. 3 things lay inside the chest. The first was money, not loose but stacked in neat columns wrapped in scraps of soft leather to keep the coins from rubbing against one another. Most of it silver, some of it gold. She did not count it that morning. She would count it that night twice, and the total would come to $147.11, a sum so large that when she finally understood it, she would sit very still on the slate floor for a long time with her hands folded in her lap. The second was a small object wrapped carefully in soft leather. She set it aside. The third, lying on top of the coins, was a letter folded twice, sealed with a drop of candle wax brown with age. She broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The paper was yellowed at the edges but dry, and the ink was brown but legible, and the hand was a careful, angular hand that wrote each letter as if it had thought about it first. The letter read, "My name is Annika Holm. I am 53 years old, and I have lived in this place for 21 years. My husband Eric built this house with his own hands between the spring of 1841 and the autumn of 1849, 3 months before the fever took him. He never slept a night inside the walls he built. I have slept inside them every night since, and I am leaving tomorrow because my body is tired and my eyes are failing, and I cannot keep the place any longer. I am going to my sister in Salem. I do not expect I will come back. I am writing this letter because I have something to say to whoever lifts this stone." Eric was a master mason of the Bergen tradition. Every master in our tradition must, before he dies, build one stenhus by his own hand to prove what his hand can do. The mason does not build his stenhus to live in. He builds it to leave. He builds it for the person who comes after, who must be able to look at it and learn from it. In the old country, the next mason is usually his own son. Eric and I had no children. Eric had only one apprentice, a young American who came to the valley in 1838 and stayed 2 years and went home with Eric's mark on his work. And Eric loved that young man as he would have loved a son, and the young man left, and Eric heard from him only twice in all the years that followed the second time, being a letter that came in 1849. 3 months before Eric died, telling Eric that the apprentice had married and had a child, and the apprentice had asked Eric whether he should pass the trade down, whether it came as son or as daughter. And Eric had written back that the trade goes where the hands are good, and never mind which kind of child. I do not know if that apprentice's child or that child's child will ever come to this valley. I do not know who will lift this stone, but I will say this. If you are the right person, you will know. The hand that lifts this stone will be a hand that has worked wood. If you are that person, what is in this chest belongs to you. The money was earned by me, 1 egg and 1 pound of butter at a time across 21 years. It is honest money, and I have no children to leave it to. Use it. The other thing in the chest is something Eric made. It is one of two. The other was sent west with his apprentice in 1840. If you ever find that you have the pair of them, then you will know what I cannot tell you in a letter. I hope this place will be as good to you as it was to me. Annika Holm, October 1851. Linnea read the letter once. She read it a second time. Then she set it aside very carefully on the slate beside her knee, and she unwrapped the small leather bundle. Inside was a carved wooden bird, a meadowlark no larger than her thumb, carved from a piece of pale birch that had aged to the color of honey. The feathers suggested by fine cuts of a knife point, the beak slightly open, the eyes 2 tiny dots of darker wood inlaid into the pale body. It was warm in her hand the way wood is always warm. It was rendered with a delicacy that was not the delicacy of a hobbyist, but the delicacy of a master practicing on the small thing in order to keep his hand calm for the large thing. She held it for a long time. Then she set it on the slate beside the letter. She put her hand into the pocket of the barn coat. She took out her grandfather's folding knife. She held it in her open palm, and she turned it so that the brass bolster faced the column of light coming down from the broken roof. There was a mark on the bolster. She had run her thumb across it 10,000 times since she was 14, the way a person worries a bead, the way a person touches the smooth place on a doorframe in passing. She had thought the mark was only a maker's stamp, worn smooth by 40 years of pocket carry. She brought the bolster close to her eye. The light was good. The light was honest. The mark was two pairs of initials separated by a small forged arrow. It read EH to MP 1838. The wooden meadowlark sat on the slate at her knee. The carved letters in the truss above her head said EH 1841. Eric Holm, Master, Magnus Penrose, Apprentice. The arrow between them, the small clean arrow that her thumb had worried smooth for 5 years, was the direction of the inheritance. Linnea Ashby sat on the cold slate floor of the great hall of Holmes Folly, with her grandfather's knife in one hand and Annika Holmes' letter in the other, and a carved meadowlark in front of her knee, and Ridge laid his chin across her ankle, and she understood finally all at once that her grandmother had been sending her here her whole life, not by blood, but by trade. She did not own this place because Annika Holm had given it to her grandmother's bloodline. She owned this place because Eric Holm had taught her grandfather, and her grandfather had taught her grandmother, and her grandmother had taught her. And the knife in her hand and the bird on the slate were two pieces of the same thing, and the building above her was the third. She was the next master in the line. She sat for a long, quiet time. She did not cry. The light moved across the slate floor and the dust hung in the broken columns, and Ridge breathed slow and warm against her ankle, and somewhere above her in the broken upper stories the wind found a pain and made its single, soft note the first note before the rest of the hymn. She put the knife back in her pocket. She wrapped the meadowlark in its leather and set it on the mantel above the fireplace. She folded the letter and set it beside the meadowlark. She lowered the hearthstone back into its recess so that the seam disappeared again because some things wanted to be put back where they had come from. Then she stood up and she pulled the barn coat closer against her ribs, and she went back to work. The work changed after that day. Before she had been a girl repairing a building she had bought for 3 cents. After she was a craftsman, finishing the work of the man who had taught her grandfather, and every cut she made, and every shake she split, and every stone she reset, was a sentence in a conversation that had been going on between Bergen and the Corbin Valley for 33 years and was not finished yet. She wrote nothing down. She did not tell anyone in the valley about the chest. She kept the knowledge inside her chest the way her grandmother had kept things in a place where they could not be lost. The cold came on. The aspens at the upper edge of the meadow lost their leaves overnight in the third week of November. Asa Halverson brought up a second sack of lime and 2 cords of dry pine and a butchered quarter of beef wrapped in clean burlap, and he would not accept any of the silver she tried to press into his hand. He said, "You can pay me in the spring with a day of your time on my fence line." She said, "I will." He said, "I know you will," and he rode away. She moved her sleeping place from the great hall into the smallest of the second-floor chambers, the one above the south porch where the chimney drew best, and the morning sun came in directly through the only window she had so far been able to reglaze. She built a bed frame from lodgepole, pegged the joints with oak. She stuffed a mattress tick with dry meadow grass and wild mint and laid her grandmother's quilt over the top. Ridge slept at the foot of the bed every night, his back against her shins, the warmth of him steady as a banked fire. The first hard storm came on the night of December the 11th. The wind out of the northwest hit the building broadside, and the whole length of the hall sang in the dark, and Linnea lay awake in her upstairs chamber listening to the storm with her hand resting on Ridge's flank. The fire in her small fireplace burned steady. The chamber was warm. The building held. In the morning, when she went down to check the Great Hall, she found that two more slates had failed on the north slope of the roof above the third truss. And the truss itself, the one that had already developed a sag, had taken on a hand's breadth more of bend. She climbed up onto the slates that afternoon. The wind had dropped, but the temperature had not risen above 20 degrees all morning, and the air on the roof was the still bone-cold air of high winter. She set in new slates. She drove the copper nails. She came down at dusk with her fingers so cold she could not bend them, and she stood by the fire in the great hall for an hour before she could feel them again. And Ridge sat at her feet and pressed the white blaze of his forehead against her knee, and she did not weep, but it was a near thing. The second storm came 3 days before Christmas, and this one was worse. It came down out of the high country with snow that fell sideways for 30 hours. And when it was done, 4 feet of snow lay against the north wall of the building, and the great hall was so cold that the cup of water beside her sleeping place upstairs had frozen solid by morning. On the second day after the storm, the sag in the third truss became a crack. She heard it. She was sitting at the workbench in the workshop, fitting a new chamber door, and the sound that came out of the great hall was a long, slow groan of green oak parting along its grain, and she dropped the chisel and ran. The truss had not fallen, but the crack had opened along the lower cord 12 feet long, dry-grained and clean, and the truss was holding by the strength of its joinery and nothing more. Above it, two more slates had failed. Snow was coming in through the gap. She knew what she had to do. She had to splice the cord. She had to sister a new timber along the cracked one and bolt the two together so that the strength of the new piece carried the load until she could replace the whole truss in the spring. The work would have to be done at the height of the truss, 22 feet above the slate floor of the great hall. And she had begun that morning to run a fever. She had felt it coming for 2 days, the slight ache behind the eyes, the papery feeling of the skin on her arms, the way the cold seemed to find her too easily. By mid-afternoon of the day, the truss cracked, her forehead was hot under her hand, and her thoughts had begun to take on the slow, loose quality of thoughts at a fever's edge. She did the work anyway. She set the long ladder against the wall. She hauled the sister timber up by a block and tackle she had rigged from the next truss over. She climbed the ladder rung by slow rung, gripping each one with both hands, before she trusted her weight to her boots, the fever singing in her ears, and Ridge whining low and unhappy at the foot of the ladder below her. And she set the sister timber against the cracked cord, and she bolted the two together with the hand-forged carriage bolts Dawson Greaves had brought her in the third week of her time at the building, and she did the work with the slow, careful attention her grandmother had taught her to bring to work when the body was failing. You do not rush. You do not skip a step. You finish what you started, or you do not start. She finished at full dark. She came down the ladder one rung at a time, the fever roaring in her ears now, and when her boot touched the slate floor of the great hall, she sat down where she was, and Ridge came and pressed his whole body against hers, and she lay down on the cold slate with his warmth against her ribs, and she did not have the strength to climb the stairs to her chamber. She slept on the floor of the great hall in her barn coat, with Ridge curled against her, and her fever rose through the night, and she dreamed of her grandmother standing in the doorway of a stone building she could not quite see the shape of, with one hand raised in the wind. She woke at dawn to the sound of someone hammering on the great oak door. She could not stand at first. She crawled to the door and lifted the latch. Ida Bergstrom stood on the porch. She had walked 4 miles up the East Fork through 4 feet of snow on a pair of long ash skis with leather bindings, because no one in the valley had seen smoke from any of the 7 chimneys for the past day and a half. And Ida had told her husband Carl at 6 that morning, in a voice that did not invite argument, that she was going up to check. Ida took one look at Linnea's face and came inside and closed the door behind her. She did not say much. She built up the fire in the great hall. She put a kettle of snow on it to melt. She helped Linnea up the stairs to the chamber, and she helped her out of her boots and into the bed, and she sat beside the bed for the next 2 days with a bowl of broth she made from the beef Asa had left and the dried herbs Imogen had brought, and she fed Linnea a spoonful at a time when Linnea could swallow. Ridge lay across the foot of the bed and did not move except once an hour to lift his head and look at Linnea's face and lay it down again. On the third day the fever broke. Linnea woke at dawn clear-headed and so weak she could not lift her arm above the quilt. Ida was asleep in the chair by the bed, her hands folded in her lap. The chamber was warm. The fire had burned down to a steady bed of coals. Outside the small reglazed window, the sun had come up over the eastern ridge and was lighting the snow on the meadow to a brightness that hurt the eyes. Ridge raised his head from the foot of the bed and looked at her, and the white blaze of his forehead caught the light, and his amber eyes were steady on her face, and he came up the bed without a sound and laid his head against her shoulder, and Linnea closed her eyes and rested her hand on the warmth of his neck. And she understood that she had come within an hour of dying on the slate floor of the great hall, and that she had not died, and that there were people in the valley who had walked 4 miles through 4 feet of snow to make sure she did not. She thought as she lay there in the warm chamber of her mother behind the locked door of the boarding house of the silence on the other side of that door of the choice her mother had made and the choice her mother had failed to make. And she did not feel anger because the fever had burned anger out of her. She felt only the quiet recognition that there were two kinds of people in the world, and that the kind who walked through the snow were the kind she had now been chosen by, and that this was the answer to a question she had been asking without knowing she was asking it for many years. Ida stirred in the chair. She opened her eyes. She saw that Linnea was awake. She said very softly, "You scared me." Linnea said, "I am sorry." Ida said, "Don't be sorry. Be careful." She got up and put another log on the fire and went downstairs to make more broth, and Ridge laid his head against Linnea's shoulder, and his breathing was slow and steady, and the morning light moved across the floor of the chamber, and Linnea slept again, and this time she did not dream. She was on her feet again in 5 days. Weak but standing. She did not climb a ladder for the rest of December. She did the indoor work. She planed the door blanks for the upstairs chambers. She fit hinges. She rebuilt a section of the great staircase where one tread had cracked. She worked slowly, and Ridge followed her from room to room and lay at her feet wherever she settled. On the third day of March, when the snow had begun to melt off the south slope of the slate roof in long dark strips, Elias Whitaker rode up the East Fork on his old chestnut horse, and his face when he reached the meadow was the face of a man carrying a piece of news he did not want to carry. He dismounted at the porch. He came up the steps. He removed his hat. He said, "Linnea," she said, "come in." He came in. He sat at the trestle table she had built from a single slab of cottonwood in the great hall before the fire. He laid an envelope on the table. He said, "This was served on me yesterday at the land office. It is an affidavit filed in the county court at Laramie. The petitioner is one Mortimer Pratt. He is petitioning for legal guardianship of one Linnea Ashby, minor child of Josephine Ashby, on the grounds that the said Linnea Ashby, being 19 years of age, and therefore 2 years short of her legal majority, is incapable of managing real property of substantial value, said property being the 40-acre parcel known as the home tract and the structures situated thereon." He paused. He said, "He has valued the building and the affidavit at $4,200. He is asking the court to award him guardianship and to transfer the legal title of the property into his name as guardian until your 21st birthday, at which time he proposes to convey it back to you, minus our reasonable expenses of administration. Linnea sat at the table. The fire moved in the great hearth. Ridge was lying at her feet. She did not move for a long minute. She said, "When is the hearing?" Elias Whitaker said, 30 days. She said, "I will be there." He said, "Linnea." She said, "I will be there." He looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the great hall around them, at the new shakes on the eastern slope, at the rehung chamber doors above, on the second-floor corridor at the splice. She had bolted 22 feet above their heads in the third truss at the carved meadowlark on the mantel and the small folded letter beside it. And he saw more clearly than he had seen anything in 26 years of looking at land in this valley, the shape of what she had done in 5 months. He said very softly, "He has no idea what he is asking for." She said, "No, he does not." Outside the great oak door, in the long dark strips where the snow had melted off the slate roof, water ran in small clean lines down the porch steps and onto the meadow grass that was beginning in the warmth of the south-facing slope to think about turning green. Mortimer Pratt did not wait the full 30 days. He came up the East Fork on the 11th of March, 8 days after Elias Whitaker had ridden up with the affidavit, and he came in a hired surrey driven by a man Linnea did not recognize. And he came with two other men beside him, both wearing the dark wool suits and stiff collars of the city, and he came with one other person sitting silent in the second seat of the surrey, with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on the floorboard, and that other person was Linnea's mother, Josephine. Linnea was on the south porch when she saw the surrey come around the last bend of the creek road. She had been splitting kindling against a stump beside the porch steps, and the axe was in her hand, and Ridge was lying in the strip of pale March sun at the foot of the porch where the snow had cleared first. She straightened slowly. She set the axe head down against the stump. She did not pick it up again. She did not move from the porch. She wiped her palms on the front of her grandmother's barn coat, and she put her hands in the pockets, and she waited. The surrey rolled to a stop at the edge of the meadow grass 20 yards from the porch. The two city men climbed down first. They stood for a moment with their heads tipped back, looking up at the building, and Linnea watched their faces and saw what Asa Halverson had told her once about men of a certain kind, that they did the arithmetic before they said hello. She saw them counting the chimneys. She saw them measuring by eye the height of the tower. She saw the first one nudge the second one with his elbow, and she saw the second one give a low, slow whistle that the wind almost carried away. Mortimer Pratt climbed down third. He was a man of 48, narrow-built, narrow-faced, with the careful pressed collar tidiness of someone who had spent his whole working life behind a counter and behind a desk and had never once worked outside in any season. His coat was new wool. His boots were town boots. His face, when he turned it up toward the porch, wore the small, precise smile of a man who believed himself to be already in possession of what he had come for. Josephine did not climb down. She sat in the second seat of the surrey with her gloved hands in her lap, and she did not look at the building, and she did not look at Linnea, and her shoulders were set in the way Linnea had known. Her shoulders to be set since she was a child, the way a person's shoulders are set when she has agreed to a thing she does not want to agree to and has not yet found the courage to say so. Mortimer Pratt walked across the meadow grass toward the porch. The two city men walked a step behind him on either side. They moved up onto the bottom step of the porch. That was when Ridge stood up. He did not bark. He did not lunge. He stood up from the patch of sun very slowly and walked the 3 steps that separated him from Linnea's left side, and he placed himself between her and the men, and he lowered his head the smallest amount, and the hackles along the saddle of darker brown on his back rose in one slow, clean ripple from his shoulders to the base of his tail, and from somewhere very deep in his chest, he produced a sound. It was not loud. It was the low, continuous note of a working animal who has identified the source of danger and has informed it of his presence and his intention. The white blaze down the center of his forehead was very bright in the pale March sun. The small notch at the top of his right ear was perfectly still. Mortimer Pratt stopped on the second step. The two city men stopped behind him. The first of them said very carefully, "Miss Ashby, call the dog off." Linnea did not move. She did not take her hands out of her pockets. She said, "He is not on. He is standing where he wishes to stand." Mortimer Pratt produced from his inside coat pocket a folded paper. He held it up in front of him at chest height. He said in his clerk's voice, the voice that had written the note pinned to the door of the boarding house 5 months earlier, he said, "Linnea, I have come up here to spare you a journey. The court will hear my petition in 3 weeks. The outcome is not in doubt. I have here a deed of voluntary conveyance. If you sign it today in front of these gentlemen who are witnesses qualified by the territorial court, the matter ends here. You will not be required to travel to Laramie. You will not be required to stand in a courtroom in front of a judge. The property will pass to me as your appointed guardian, and I will administer it in your interest until you reach your majority. You will be permitted to remain on the premises in the meantime in a capacity to be determined." He paused. He extended the paper a few inches further. He said, "This is a kindness. You should accept it." Linnea looked at the paper. She looked at the man holding it. She looked past him at the surrey where her mother sat with her hands folded in her lap, and she saw her mother's shoulders move once, a small involuntary movement. The movement of a person who had not known until that moment what her own daughter looked like when she was standing on the porch of a building she had restored with her own hands across the worst winter of her life. Linnea did not raise her voice. She said, "Mr. Pratt, you will get back into your surrey. You will go back the way you came. There is no signature you will receive from me on this porch." Mortimer Pratt's small, precise smile did not change. He said, "Linnea, you are 19 years old. The law is the law. You may delay this, but you cannot escape it." She said, "I am not delaying it. I am inviting it." He said, "I beg your pardon." She said, "You filed your petition in the district court at Laramie. I have written to Judge Calvert and asked him to come to this property and see for himself what you have valued at $4,200 and what you propose to administer in my interest. I have asked him to ride up the East Fork in the 3rd week of March and to walk through this building and the workshop behind it before he hears your petition. He has written back. He has accepted the invitation. He arrives on the 22nd. Mortimer Pratt's smile thinned. He said, "Judges do not ride out to examine properties." She said, "This one is going to." He stood with the paper still extended for a moment longer. Then he lowered it. He folded it once. He put it back inside his coat. Behind him, the two city men had taken a careful half-step backward off the porch step. He said in a voice that had hardened into something sharper than his clerk's voice, he said, "You will regret this." She said, "I have done my regretting. I am done with it now." He turned. He walked back across the meadow grass. The two city men walked behind him. They climbed into the surrey. Mortimer Pratt climbed up last into the seat beside Josephine, and he sat down without looking at her, and the surrey turned in the meadow and started back down the creek road. Josephine looked back, once, briefly. Her eyes met Linnea's across 30 yards of pale grass. She did not lift her hand. She did not speak. But her eyes were the eyes of a woman who had ridden up the East Fork in a surrey she had not chosen to ride in on an errand she had not chosen to run. and who had seen for the first time the shape of the daughter she had allowed to be put out of doors on a Saturday in October. The surrey passed around the bend and was gone. Linnea stood on the porch with her hands in the pockets of the barn coat. Ridge lowered his hackles slowly, one section of his back at a time, until they lay smooth again, and the low, continuous note in his chest faded into silence, and he sat down at her left side and leaned his shoulder against her knee, and she let her hand come down out of her pocket and rest on the warm flat of his head, and she felt the fast, steady beat of his heart through the bones of her wrist. She stood very still. The wind moved across the meadow. The bend of the road was empty. Then she turned and went back to the splitting stump and picked up the axe and finished the kindling she had started before the surrey came. She had 11 days. She worked them the way her grandmother had taught her to work the last days before a deadline, which was not faster but slower. You did not rush the final work. You let the work tell you what it needed. You walk through the job at the beginning of each day, and you walk through it at the end of each day, and you made the list of what you would do tomorrow before you slept. And you slept because a tired hand makes a poor joint. She finished the splice on the third truss. She replaced the failed slates on the north slope of the roof, working in the long, cold mornings when the slope was still hard climbing down at midday when the sun made the slate slick. She rehung the last of the chamber doors on the second floor. She reglazed the 4 remaining windows in the great hall, fitting the glass Imogen had brought her one piece at a time, sealing each pane with linseed putty she had mixed herself from oil and chalk. She rebuilt the cap of the third chimney from the east where 2 stones had fallen, and she matched the courses so exactly that when she was finished, a person standing in the meadow could not tell which stones had been reset and which had stood untouched for 21 years. She did one other thing. She did it on the evening of the 7th day when the light was failing and Ridge was asleep on the rug beside the great hearth. She took down from the mantel the carved meadowlark that Eric Holm had made in his first winter in the cabin he never lived in. She set it on the trestle table. She brought from the workshop a small block of pale birch she had cut from a tree behind the house in November. She took her grandfather's folding knife from her pocket. She opened it. She set the blade to the birch and she began to carve a second meadowlark. She worked at it for 4 nights in the hour after supper before sleep. She did not work fast. She watched Eric's bird and she did not copy it, stroke for stroke, because her grandmother had taught her that the apprentice does not copy the master. The apprentice answers him. She made her own bird of her own size and her own posture. The head slightly cocked. The beak closed the eyes, still to be marked. She finished the second bird on the night of the 11th day. Judge Hiram Calvert arrived on the morning of the 22nd, as he had said he would, in a sturdy buggy driven by a young clerk from his chambers. He was 61 years old. He had been a judge of the Territorial District Court for 19 years and a lawyer for 20 before that, and he had spent his boyhood on a cattle ranch in Nebraska and had not lost the look of it. He was a tall, lean man with a long jaw and pale gray eyes and a habit of saying very little. He climbed down from the buggy and stood for a moment in the meadow grass and looked up at the building, and his face did not change at all, and the only sign that he had registered what he was looking at was a small, slow exhale, almost a sigh that he did not seem to know he had let go. Mortimer Pratt had come up an hour earlier in his hired surrey with the same 2 city men as before, and they stood in a small, uncomfortable cluster at the edge of the meadow, and the smile on Mortimer Pratt's face had thinned to a line. Linnea came down from the porch. Ridge walked at her left side. She wore the barn coat. Her hair was tied back at the nape of her neck. Her hands were clean. She had washed them twice that morning at the well because her grandmother had taught her that a craftsman shows up to a judging with clean hands. Judge Calvert took off his hat. He said, "Miss Ashby," she said, "Your Honor, thank you for coming." He said, "Show me what you have done." She walked him through the building. She did not narrate. She walked beside him and she let the building speak. She showed him the great hall and the 7 trusses overhead and the splice she had bolted into the third one. She showed him the great hearth and the slate floor she had relayed in the place where it had broken. She climbed the staircase with him to the second floor and showed him the 4 chamber doors and the chamber where she slept. She climbed the second staircase to the third floor and showed him the dormers she had reglazed. She climbed the spiral stair into the tower with him, and Judge Calvert stood at the south window of the tower room with his hands clasped behind his back, and he looked out across the valley, and he stood there for a long minute, and then he said very quietly, almost to himself, "From this room a man can see weather an hour before it gets here." Linnea said, "Yes, Your Honor. He said a man could see a rider on the river road before the rider saw him." She said, "Yes, Your Honor." He looked at her sidelong. He said nothing more. She brought him down and out to the workshop. She showed him the forge. She showed him the long stone bench where Eric Holm had cut every block and every wall around them. She showed him the tools she had hung on pegs above the workbench, each one labeled in her grandmother's hand, each label brought down from the cabin on the ridge, because Linnea had ridden up there in February with Asa Halverson and brought down what was left of her grandmother's tools before the lumber company could clear the site. Then she walked him back into the great hall and she stopped at the trestle table. On the table she had laid out, before he arrived, a small, ordered group of objects. A ledger book open, a sheaf of receipts, a piece of paper with a list of names, and at the far end of the table, set side by side, on a square of clean linen, 2 small carved wooden birds. Judge Calvert looked at the ledger. She said, "Your Honor, Mr. Pratt's affidavit values this property at $4,200. He proposes to administer that value in my interest until my 21st birthday. I would like the court to consider what value I have administered on this property in the 5 months since I purchased it for $2.80. He bent over the ledger. She turned the pages for him one at a time. She had logged every hour she had worked. She had logged every piece of material she had used. She had logged every shake split, every slate set, every pound of mortar mixed, every hinge hung, every joint cut. At the back of the ledger, she had logged every paid commission she had taken from neighbors in the valley across the winter, because she had not been only restoring the building. She had been working as a craftsman of the valley while she did so. She had built Dawson Greaves a new tongs rack for his forge in November and an oak cabinet for his shop in February. She had cut and hung a heavy outer door for Asa Halverson's hay barn in December. She had built Imogen Marsh a 6-shelf bookcase for the schoolroom in January and 3 desks in February. She had built Ida Bergstrom a kitchen work table. She had built the Loon family a tool chest for their oldest boy. She had logged it all: hours, materials, the price agreed, and the price paid. Judge Calvert ran his finger down the column on the last page. He said $312. She said, "Yes, Your Honor. The value of paid commissioned work performed by my hands in this valley between November and March. The value of restoration labor on this property in the same period, calculated at the going rate for a journeyman carpenter in the territory, is $840 more. The total value administered on this property and produced from it in 5 months by the hands of the 19-year-old whom Mr. Pratt has petitioned the court to find incapable comes to $1,152. Judge Calvert was silent. He turned the page. She said, "At the back of the ledger, Your Honor, is a list of names. 12 names, 12 persons in this valley who have agreed to testify before the court if called as to the quality of the work I have produced for them. 8 of them have ridden in this morning to be present here today. They are sitting in their wagons at the bend of the road waiting to be called if you wish to call them. Judge Calvert lifted his head. He looked at her. He said, "You called witnesses to your own land." She said, "I called witnesses to my work." He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "Miss Ashby, may I ask you a question that is not on the record?" She said, "You may." He said, "Did you know what this building was when you bought it?" She said, "No, Your Honor. I knew it was stone. I did not know what it meant." He said, "And now?" She said, "Now I know it was built by a man named Eric Holm, born in Bergen in Norway, who came to this valley in 1840 and built this building with his own hands across 8 years to prove what a master mason of his tradition is required to prove before he dies. I know that he had one apprentice in his life. I know that the apprentice came to this valley in 1838 and stayed 2 years and went home to the ridge above Harlan and worked his trade for the rest of his life and raised a daughter who became my grandmother, who taught me what she knew. I know that the knife in my pocket was made by Eric Holm in 1838 and given to his apprentice as the mark of the trade, and the apprentice was my grandfather Magnus Penrose. I know I am the third generation of this line, and I know that this building was waiting for the third generation. Your Honor, that is what I know now." Judge Calvert did not speak. She picked up Eric Holmes' wooden meadowlark from the square of linen. She held it on the flat of her palm. Then she picked up the second bird, the one she had finished 4 nights earlier, and she held them side by side, the small carved master and the small carved apprentice, the same posture in the same wood, 21 years between them. She set them both back on the linen. Judge Calvert closed the ledger very gently. He stood up straight. He turned to Mortimer Pratt, who was standing at the far end of the great hall with the 2 city men, and the small, precise smile had gone entirely from Mortimer Pratt's face. Judge Calvert said in the slow, careful voice of a man who was about to say something on the record, even though there was no clerk present to record it, he said, "Mr. Pratt, I have ridden up here in part to determine whether a young woman of 19 years is capable of managing real property of substantial value. I have my answer. I will tell you a second thing which is not strictly within the scope of the petition you filed, but which I will say anyway. Your petition is denied. It will be denied in writing on Monday morning in my chambers in Laramie. You will further be required by separate order, which I am also issuing on Monday, to pay the court costs of the proceeding, which will include the cost of my buggy and my clerk's time. If I find on examination of the affidavit you submitted that any statement contained in it was made with knowledge of its falsity, I will refer the matter to the territorial attorney. I will see you on Monday. Good day, sir." Mortimer Pratt opened his mouth. He closed it again. He turned and walked the length of the great hall and out the great oak door, and the 2 city men walked behind him, and Linnea heard the surrey turn in the meadow and start back down the creek road, and she did not turn to watch it go. Judge Calvert put his hat back on. He stood for a moment in front of the trestle table. He said, "Miss Ashby, may I keep one thing in my memory from this morning? May I keep the picture of the 2 birds?" She said, "You may, Your Honor." He said, "Thank you for the hospitality." He turned to walk out, and at the door he paused and he turned back, and he said in a different voice, a voice that was no longer the voice of the bench, but only the voice of a man. He said, "My grandfather was a stonecutter. In Vermont, he died when I was 9. I have not thought of him in 20 years until I walked into your hall this morning." He looked at her for a long second. He said, "Take care of it." He went out. She stood at the trestle table with the two birds on the linen in front of her, and Ridge sat at her feet, and the great hall was very still, and from somewhere outside on the meadow, a meadowlark, a real one, the first of the spring, sang its long, thin, descending song. Linnea sat down on the bench at the trestle table. She put her face in her hands, and she sat there for a long minute, and her shoulders moved once. Ridge stood up and laid his chin on her knee. Elias Whitaker rode up the East Fork 2 days later. He carried with him a wooden document box that he had carried up the road in his saddle, and the wood of the box was old, and the iron lock on it was older. He came up onto the porch, and Linnea brought him in and set him at the trestle table and gave him coffee. He said, "Linnea, I have been keeping something. I have been keeping it for 11 years. I did not give it to you in October because I was not certain you were the right person. I was certain by Christmas. I would have given it to you then, but I wanted to see you stand in front of Judge Calvert first, and I will say to you now plainly that I have never in 26 years on this bench of mine seen anything in this valley as fine as what you did in this hall on Tuesday." He set the box on the table. He took a small iron key from his vest pocket and opened it. Inside the box was a single sealed envelope. The envelope was yellowed at the edges. The seal was a drop of brown wax. The address on the front, in the careful angular hand Linnea had now seen in 2 places, read, "To the person who has earned this place. To be opened by Elias Whitaker when he is certain." Linnea broke the seal. She unfolded the paper inside. It was a codicil to a will, notarized in the territorial court at Laramie on the 14th of October, 1851, signed by Annika Holm, witnessed by Elias Whitaker, then 54 years of age, and by Asa Halverson, then 54 years of age, and by a third name. Linnea did not recognize the name of a man who had been the previous land assessor and was now dead. The codicil read, "I, Annika Holm, of sound mind and full body, being about to depart this valley, which has been my home for 21 years, do hereby direct that the property known as the Holm Tract, comprising 40 acres at the head of the East Fork of Corbin Creek, together with the structure thereon known as the Stenhus, be held in abeyance by the office of the county assessor for so long as may be necessary, and be conveyed in due course to the first person who shall present himself or herself at that office, in possession of 3 conditions. First, that the person shall have come to this valley not in pursuit of the property, but as a stranger in need of a place to stand. Second, that the person shall have demonstrated by his or her own hand, and within the span of 1 full year of residence upon the property, the capacity to restore it as a craftsman would restore it, not as an owner would maintain it. Third, that the person shall, upon examination by the assessor or by a court, be found to stand in the line of the trade. The judgment of these conditions is left to the discretion of the assessor, who shall hold this codicil sealed until he is certain. The property is not to be sold for money. The property is to be given in due course to the next mason. So I have written, so I have signed. Annika Holm. Linnea read it once. She did not move. Elias Whitaker said very quietly, "You met all 3 conditions. You met the first the day you walked into my office with the dog. You met the second by the night you bolted that splice in the 3rd truss with a fever on you. You met the third the morning you set the 2 birds on the linen in front of Judge Calvert. He said this place was always going to be yours, not because of who you were related to, because of what you can do with your hands." Annika understood that. Eric understood it. Your grandmother understood it. Your grandfather understood it. He folded the codicil and placed it back inside the wooden box and pushed the box across the table. He said, "This is the proof, if you ever need it, that the title is yours by Annika's own writing, free of any guardianship, free of any sale price, free of anything Mortimer Pratt or any man like him will ever attempt against it. It will be filed in the court records on Monday in Laramie under the seal of Judge Calvert. Nobody is going to take this from you, Linnea, not as long as you can hold a tool. She sat at the trestle table with her hands flat on the wood and Ridge at her feet, and she thought of the woman who had written the codicil, and the man who had built the building, and the man who had taught her grandfather and the grandmother who had taught her, and the line that had reached her across 33 years. And she said only in a very quiet voice, "Thank you, Mr. Whitaker." He said, "Don't thank me. I was only the keeper." He drank the rest of his coffee. He put on his hat. He rode away. David Ashby came up the East Fork on the 2nd of May alone. He came on the old gray mare that had been their father's. He rode up at mid-morning. He did not bring his wife. He did not bring his mother. He came alone, and he wore the brown wool coat that had been Ansel Ashby's coat, and in the saddlebag behind his right knee, he carried a wooden chest the size of a small bread box. And when he came up onto the porch, he set the chest at his feet, and he did not knock on the door. He stood at the porch rail and he waited. Linnea saw him from the workshop. Ridge saw him at the same time. She walked across the meadow with Ridge at her left side, and she came up the porch steps, and she stopped 4 feet from her brother, and she did not speak. He looked at her. He looked at the dog. He looked at the building behind her. He looked back at her. He said very simply, "Linnea, I am sorry." She did not speak. He said, "I knew. The day Pratt pinned that note, I knew. I sat on the other side of the door, and I knew, and I did not open it. I have known every day since then. I am sorry." She did not speak. He said, "I am not asking you to forgive me. I came to give you something that has been in our house since before you were born, that should have come to you, and I did not bring it to you in October because I was a coward. And I bring it to you now because I am still a coward, but at least I am a coward who has gotten on a horse." He bent and picked up the chest. He set it on the porch rail. He said this was Father's. Mother gave it to Pratt 3 years ago. Pratt threw it in the back of the woodshed because he could not read what was inside it, and he thought it was nothing. I took it out of the woodshed last week. I rode the long way around so he would not see me leave. He opened the chest. Inside were 3 things: a folded surveyor's map of the Upper Corbin Valley made by Ansel Ashby in his work as a timber cruiser for the lumber company, a bound notebook in their father's hand, and wrapped in a piece of soft chamois, a single object Linnea did not at first recognize. She picked up the notebook. She opened it. She turned to a page near the back. In her father's slow, careful handwriting was a note dated the 7th of June, 1851, 4 years before Ansel had died. The note read, "Walked the head of the East Fork today, hired by Corbin Lumber to assess timber on the abandoned home tract. Did not mark a single tree. Walked the meadow and stood inside the stone hall instead. Stood there a long time. The hall is the finest piece of stonework I have ever seen in this country, and I have seen most of it. Told the company there was no timber on the parcel worth the cost of cutting. Lied about that. There is good cedar in the upper draw, and the lodge pole on the north slope is straight as a gun. Lied because I will not be the one to mark the trees that grow above a building like that. Some buildings are not for cutting around. Some buildings are for letting alone. Filed my false report. Took the lie home in my chest. Will carry it the rest of my life. A.A." Linnea closed the notebook. She unwrapped the chamois. Inside was a small block of pale birch the size of a thumb. Not finished. Begun. A bird half emerged from the wood, the head shaped, the body suggested, the wings still inside the block waiting. David said he started it the year he came home from that survey. He never finished it. I do not know who he was carving it for. Linnea looked at the half-finished bird in her hand. She thought of the meadowlark on the mantle. She thought of the second meadowlark on the linen. She thought of her father who had walked into this hall 10 years before her and had stood in it a long time and had walked out and lied to his employer in order to leave the building untouched, and who had taken a piece of birch back to the ridge with him and had begun to carve in the language of the trade he had not been trained in, the only answer he knew how to give to what he had seen. She closed her hand around the half-finished bird. She said, "David." He said, "Yes." She said, "Stay tonight. There is a chamber upstairs. The fire draws." He said, "I will." She said, "And tomorrow I will show you the building, from the slate floor to the top of the tower." He said, "Yes." He sat down on the porch steps slowly with the careful, uncertain motion of a man who had not been certain he would be allowed to sit. He put his face in his hands, and his shoulders moved once, twice, and Ridge walked over to him and laid his head against the brother's knee, and David put one hand down without looking and rested it on the dog's neck. Linnea walked to the porch rail, and she stood there a long minute looking out at the meadow and at the spring grass that had come up green across the south slope, and her throat was tight, and she did not move until Ridge came back and pressed his shoulder against her knee. The summer came on. The valley turned green and then gold. The well water ran cold and sweet. The garden Linnea had laid out in the strip of dark soil along the creek came up in long, even rows of turnip and onion and bean, and the row of sunflowers she had planted along the south edge, because Annika had written about beauty, and Linnea agreed with her that beauty was worth making. Asa Halverson rode up in June with a young man of 17 riding behind him on a borrowed mule. The young man was a quiet boy from a homestead 20 miles south who had begged his father to send him north because he had heard there was a young craftsman at the head of the East Fork who might take an apprentice. Asa stayed for coffee. The boy stayed for 3 years and learned to cut stone and to hang a door and to read the grain of a board and to walk through a building before laying a tool to it. Ida Bergstrom came up every other Sunday with bread and news. Dawson Greaves brought his oldest daughter up in August to be measured for a desk she had outgrown. Imogen Marsh came up in September with a class of 7 children to see. She said what a building looked like when somebody loved it. Halvor Lund grew 6 inches in a year and came up to help with the haying in August and stayed for supper. Elias Whitaker rode up once a month every month until he retired 3 years later, and he handed off the assessor's office to a young man whom he had personally instructed to leave the head of the East Fork alone. David came up every Sunday for a year. He brought Josephine the first time in November on a clear, cold day, and Josephine walked through the great hall with her hand on the trestle table and her other hand at her throat, and she did not say much, and at the porch before she left, she put her gloved hand briefly against Linnea's cheek and said in a whisper, "You are your grandmother." And Linnea put her own hand over her mother's hand and held it there for a long second, and that was the beginning of something that took years to grow back, and grew back imperfectly, and grew back anyway. Mortimer Pratt was indicted on the 2nd of June by the territorial attorney for the false statements in the affidavit, and he was convicted in September, and he was fined $400 and forbidden from holding any guardianship or fiduciary office in the territory for the remainder of his life. He left the valley before the snow came. Linnea did not see him again. On the evening of the 22nd of June one year, And one day after Linnea Ashby had walked up the creek road and seen Holmes' Folly for the first time, she sat on the south porch in the long, slow light of a summer evening, and Ridge lay at her feet with his chin across her boot. The white blaze down the center of his forehead was the same clean line it had been the morning she had first seen him in the grass at the edge of the road. The small notch at the top of his right ear was the same. The thin, faded red nylon collar she had never replaced was the same. She had on her lap a small leather-bound notebook she had made for herself in the workshop in April, hand-stitched, the cover oiled and rubbed. She had not yet written in it. She had been saving it. On the mantel above the great hearth inside the hall behind her, ranged in the order they had come to her, were the objects she had gathered across 1 year. Magnus Penrose's folding knife, Eric Holmes' carved meadowlark, Annika Holmes' letter folded, Annika Holmes' codicil sealed inside its wooden box, Ansel Ashby's notebook with his June 1851 entry, the half-finished bird her father had begun and never finished, Linnea's own finished bird, the second meadowlark set beside Eric's, and next to her own bird, the third bird she had begun in May for the boy from the homestead 20 miles south who would receive it on the day he completed his apprenticeship. A line of birds on the mantel of the great hall in Holmes' Folly, the line that ran from Bergen to the Corbin Valley to whatever came next. She opened the notebook. She took her grandfather's knife from her pocket and used the small blade to sharpen the end of a pencil. She put the knife back in her pocket. She turned to the first blank page. She wrote in the slow, careful hand her grandmother had taught her. My name is Linnea Ashby. I am 20 years old this week. I am a stonemason and a carpenter in the line that began in Bergen in Norway and came to this valley in 1840 and ran through Eric Holm and Magnus Penrose and Hester Penrose and now through me. This is the Stenhus that Eric built. I am the keeper of it. The next mason will sit on this porch one day and write what I have written, and the bird I have made for that mason is already on the mantel waiting, and that is how it goes. She closed the notebook. The sun was settling behind the western ridge. The 7 chimneys of the great building behind her caught the last of the light and held it. From the meadow below the porch, a real meadowlark sang its long descending note, and Ridge lifted his head once and laid it back down on her boot, and the small notch in his right ear flicked once and was still. Linnea Ashby sat on the porch of Holmes' stone house in the long gold evening of her 20th summer, and she did not weep, but her hand rested on the warm flat of the dog's head, and her other hand rested on the closed notebook in her lap. And the wind from the upper valley moved across the 7 chimneys and through the open windows of the great hall behind her, and the building sang very softly the way a great instrument sings when it has been tuned and is ready to be played. And inside that sound, somewhere very far away and very close, she could hear her grandmother saying in the voice she had used at the workbench when a piece of work had come out true, "Feel that. That is the wood telling you where it wants to go." Linnea closed her eyes. She listened. Ridge breathed slow and warm against her boot. The light went amber and then rose, and then the soft slate blue that comes before dark in mountain country, and the day ended and she was home.